the fight for the history to be correct is one of the most important fights of all.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm your host and the editor, and I'm very pleased to have Douglas Murray on the pod. You heard him at the top there, and I was keen to chat to Douglas because of his new book, The War on the West. It's a polemic which tackles head-on the recent attempts at shame for much, if not all, of Western history. Now, Douglas discusses the importance of history being correct there, and it's something that we at Aspects of History take very seriously. Our chat concentrates on that history, and in particular Winston Churchill, but we also briefly mention his book of 10 years ago, Bloody Sunday, and a bit on critical race theory and reparations for slavery. Now, for listeners of this episode, we have an offer on the Aspects of History annual subscription, which is usually at only $9.99, but with a voucher code, History 50%, and that's in the show notes, it's available at half price, so only £5. Head to our website to find out more. If you can subscribe or even leave a review, I'd be delighted, but I'll leave you to my chat with Douglas Murray. Okay, so Douglas Murray, thank you very much for joining me on the Aspects of History podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
And it's on the day of your publication as well.
It is. It is. It's a busy time, but it's an exciting time. Launching a new book is I'm not a parent, but I think it's a bit like bringing a child out into the world, in that you sort of hope everyone's going to love it, but you also know that it's dangerous out there.
Well, particularly for you, Douglas, because a lot of your stuff does attract, I don't know, it certainly attracts comment, which is fantastic. Mm-hmm. But I got to be honest, I haven't read, the only one of yours I've read before this is the Bloody Sunday Inquiry, which I thought was brilliant.
I'm so glad you say that, because I'm very proud of that book, and very few people have read it. It took me an awfully long time, an enormous amount of work, so I'm delighted you've read it. Thank you.
Oh well, I mean, as I was reading it, I was thinking how much work must have gone into this, because you seem to have attended so much of. Did you attend the whole? I
didn't attend. For any readers who don't know, this is the inquiry into the killings on Bloody Sunday in Londonderry in 1972. It was a long contested issue, and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. There was a lot of ill feeling about it because of some right recognition that the army had done wrong, which had been a sort of cover up at judicial level in the UK. And then 30 years later, the Prime Minister orders an inquiry, and it went on for 10 years. And in fact, as your listeners will be well aware of this, but I mean, before that, the longest judicial proceedings in the UK ever was the impeachment trial of Warren Hastings. That looked like a positively fleeting legal issue compared to the Bloody Sunday inquiry. And yes, I mean, there were thousands of witnesses, thousands of days of evidence. I went to all of the most important days, the soldiers, the victims and others. But it was probably per hour of work to book ratio about the most work you could put into a book, because the volumes of evidence I needed to go through, it was just millions and millions. I had an entire room filled with Bloody Sunday files, because you had just know so much about it. And when I wrote that book, I was very aware, and again, you'll know this writing history yourself, but that I had to do justice to the whole thing in the round, whilst making it understandable to the widest possible audience. And I really enjoyed that challenge of distilling a really complex story, which was made complex not least by the fact that, you know, when people 30 years or 40 years actually in the end later are trying to remember something, we discover that our memories are very fallible. And I learned personally so much from that process. I read into the psychology of memory and much more. And I realized that, for historians, it's even more complex than we thought, because even our memories aren't fixed. And, anyhow, it's a long answer, but I found a really invigorating and sobering process of a reminder of how difficult it is to get to historical truths.
Absolutely. And I think also for such a sensitive issue on both sides, you managed to deal with it very even-handedly as well. I thought that it was very fair.
Well, of course, I'm a unionist. That I believe in the United Kingdom staying together. But, the British troops that day definitely did wrong, some of them. And, sometimes there were some people who were rather surprised that I'd written that book, considering that that's, one of the conclusions. But, if somebody does something wrong, as the dedicatee of that book, the historian Ruth Dudley Edwards said to me, she said at one point, she said to me, all we can do, Douglas, is to tell the truth. And I thought that I was so moved by that.
Absolutely. Well, we're here to talk about the war on the West. But I could talk about the Bloody Sunday Inquiry book with you for a long time. But so this book, which I've read and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And for the first chapter on race and China, there was laugh out loud moments for me.
I'm so pleased.
Well, I do rather your sense of humor, which is also in the Bloody Sunday Inquiry book as well. It does slightly appeal to me, actually. But
I sort of think, as you know, that it's important to try to keep a narrative going. To among other things, humor is without being deliberate about it or forcing it. It's just there are times when what you're writing about is ludicrous, particularly in the war on the West. I had to do the audio version. I wanted to do the audio version, and did. And I had the same problem with this book as I did for my previous book, The Madness of Crowds, which is that I kept on corpsing, as they say in the theatrical world. I kept on corpsing whilst doing the reading. And I had to keep explaining to the sound engineers that I wasn't laughing at my own jokes. I was laughing at the absurdity of people I was quoting, which on the page very often reads absurd. But when you read it out loud, it's even more so,
Well, one thing that strikes me that I did want to mention, but it's sort of towards the end of the book, is the garden situation. I had no idea gardens could be racist. I had no idea.
Yes, isn't that amazing? It's sort of I do subheadings again, also to sort of whip along the narrative. I always find that it's useful for me as a reader and others. If you see hundreds of pages of text and no breaks, it can be off-putting to the reader. Subheadings are very useful for that, and I quite enjoy subheadings that are true, descriptive, and utterly ludicrous. And my two favorites from the war on the West is the subheading "Racist Babies," which is the allegation that even 2-month-old white children can express racism or some such nonsense. And my other favorite subheading is "Racist Gardening." Yes, racist gardening is the claim that even gardening is racist because, as one Canadian academic put it, lawns are racist, apparently, because lawns demonstrate order. And by the way, the person writing this clearly is a racist himself, because that means that Black people represent disorder, which is a profoundly racist claim. Why white people would represent order is beyond me. White people are able to be disordered as anyone else. But yes, and also, of course, the claim that Kew Gardens and others are now forcing on us and on themselves, which is that you need to decolonize horticulture. I can't help thinking that a world that believes that there is any priority to decolonizing horticulture is a world very close to collapse. You can't have very much to do with your time if you think that your main task in life must be to explain why the shrubs are racist.
It really is bonkers. Some of this stuff is just crazy.
The people won't believe some of this. You have to see it in the book. Everything is footnoted. Everything is evidence. But some people just wouldn't believe the claims that are made.
Yeah. Now, one area that you do go into that I've been quite new to this, because until relatively recently, I worked for a large financial institution which is very interested in this kind of stuff as well. End goal is to make more money for any large institution. Attract the right graduates and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But yes, this critical race theory and white privilege. And I was very struck by that quote you gave of Thomas Sowell's.
Yes.
Which incidentally, I was looking.
Thomas Sowell is a great man. Great man. I mentioned him in The Madness of Crowds as well. One of the most distinguished modern American thinkers, a conservative, and he happens to be black, which the left will never forgive him for.
And his argument seemed to be, we are kind of at the stage where there isn't really. I mean, there are pockets of racism, but endemic racism in the United States is kind of.
It's very much, it exists, like a lot of very ugly things. You can't entirely stamp it out of this world as much as you might like to, but it is at the furthest fringes of society. Nobody who's actively racist against black people or anything else is permitted anywhere near public life, and quite rightly.
Yeah, and I think there's no way you could argue with that. But one thing that interested me was around critical race theory, which I find very uncomfortable. For me, we're all equal. We're all human beings on the planet.
We were brought up to believe that and know it. Yeah.
But there are areas, and I think I'd read somewhere, sort of mortgage applications, for example, where there is a little, there is like statistically, if one looks at that, could one see a sort of an element of where one color is discriminated against, in not necessarily in favor of another, but just.
There are claims that that's the case with certain names, applying for mortgages and so on. Well, there are statistics that show, for instance, that in contemporary America, I mean, median average household income, but also the amount in total assets that a household have, that there is a pretty significant disproportion between the assets of the average white household and the assets of an average black household. Now, that is definitely a challenge. It is not obvious, and some listeners will be surprised to this, but it is not obvious that the answer to that is racism, or that the cause of that is racism. And one reason we know that is because, as it happens, the same statistics show that the average Asian American household is better off than the average white American household. And the average Latino, Hispanic household is between the average black American household and the average white American household. So if the explanation for everything was institutional racism and white supremacy, which is what the purveyors of critical race theory claim, then they haven't been able to provide any evidence that would suggest it, because it would mean that it was a very incompetent white supremacist society, which was incompetent at keeping Asians down, for instance. It would mean that the white supremacists were so overrun with keeping black Americans down that they didn't have time to apply themselves to the Asian Americans, but maybe they'll get there in due course. I don't think that is the answer. I think that racism is a factor in some aspects of life. By the way, the most obvious of which has nothing to do with this is dating and marriage, and there's nothing much you can do about that. I mean, although there's much more intermarriage in America now, and year on year. In Britain, it's the same. People are less and less bothered by that. But for instance, in the black community, it's much more common to marry other black Americans than it is to marry out. That's very common across communities. But so, I mean, is that racism? I'm not sure if we could simplify it like that. But the point I was coming to is that on things like average household earnings, average assets, mortgage applications, and much more, I do think we're dealing with a multidimensional problem. And it's unwise to claim that there's ever one explanation for everything you encounter. And it seems to me not just unwise, but provable. But using racism as the sole lens to look at everything is not fit for purpose. That there are other issues that exist in the case of, and I mean, many Black American writers have written about this. Coleman Hughes, Thomas Chatterton Williams, and Thomas Sowell have written about the fact that one of the things that is the cause of American Black families having less household assets is fatherless families. I mean, everybody knows that that once a family splits up, or if it was never together, and let alone if a mother is in a situation of having to bring up children on her own, which is sadly and again provably more the case in certain communities, then that does have a knock-on effect on income. It has a knock-on effect on your ability to apply for a mortgage and be approved for a mortgage. And again, that isn't necessarily because the mortgage brokers are white supremacists. It's because they are working out whether the bank is likely to be able to be repaid. And it is just so unhelpful to do what the critical race theorists and others do and just claim that nothing else is an issue, that racism is the only issue.
What struck me about throughout the book is just the sort of lazy thinking. And I really want to get on.
You must finish that clause, by the way. You said what really struck me about the book is the lazy thinking.
Yes, sorry.
I wouldn't like that.
From the critical race theorist, I should point out to the listeners. Yes. And one area that I've been reading about that I'm interested in, because I did ancient history at university, is this approach to the classics as being viewed as elitist. Well, it's always had that, but also concentrating far too much on the Mediterranean, and should we be looking at other areas? And one article I'd read, written by an academic in America, I think at Princeton, was arguing that Latin and Greek should not be required to be studied in a classics degree because it's effectively racist to make Black people study these two subjects because it's sort of too difficult for them, and I find that incredibly racist.
Well, it is, but it's one of many such things. The classics are one of the first victims of this, but this same claim has now ridden across every discipline. Again, people will have to see chapter and verse and footnoted in The War in the West, the extent to which this has flooded through everything. But my old alma mater of Oxford University, there are calls within the music faculty there to stop teaching musical literacy. That is, you would be able to get a degree in music at Oxford University without being able to read music. What's the explanation? That the Western notation system was come up with by that worst of all categories, dead white males. And when I first encountered that argument, I thought this is insane because, there are several different musical systems across the globe that have been developed that have pitch and time, which are the two things you need to have for an accurate notation system. There's a system of a kind in China, and there's been one that's been developed in India and others, but none is as accurate as Western notation system. And we know that because if you were to play a Beethoven piano concerto to somebody writing in any non-Western system of notation, they could not write it down and then play back to you something that resembled that Beethoven piano concerto. Whereas when various ethnomusicologists from the West traveled to Bali, for instance, they wrote down gamelan music and played it back to the locals using the Western notation system. It just works better. It's like the argument against free markets. It's that it was produced by white men, and well, again, it's not because it was produced by white men. It's because it works. But sometimes I think people think, well, this is the sort of nonsense that goes on in the humanities, but that would stop at STEM. And as I show in The War on the West, it doesn't stop at STEM. It doesn't stop anywhere. Mathematics is in the process of being decolonized, just like the gardens and everything else. There is an attempt in America, something called equitable maths, which is a movement to stop Black children and others having to do maths because they have other ways of knowing. Now, this goes back to your point of something that is actually racist in the name of anti-racism. The best way for any young Black American, like any white American or anyone else, who is born into a poor background, the best chance, the only chance they will have in their lives, arguably, the only ladder they've got access to is the ladder of education, which is the ladder that most of us climb. And if you don't have that, then you can't get to anywhere out of the situation, and you'll just be stuck. Well, this movement in education in America says, no, demanding that Black Americans and others do maths is racist, and therefore we should say that there are other forms of knowing, which, by the way, is never defined at all. And this is, I'm afraid, an attempt to get around another inequity, which is the inequitable results in mathematics tests. I would have thought the answer to that, again, is to work harder at making sure that young Black Americans, as well as everyone else, is better educated. You will be unsurprised, or surprised perhaps, to learn that the main American teaching union has decided that tests are the problem because testing is racist. And so the answer is to do away with testing. Now, what we have just between us outlined in the last few minutes is the complete destruction of education as we know it, starting from what you say about the classics and going there through the humanities, STEM, and right up to just the idea of testing people and having exams. I don't need to explain that this is a disaster for everybody, and it must be pushed back against. It's not anything to do with racism. This is a movement that uses racism as the one explanation for everything, but in actual fact uses it as a lazy explanation. Teaching unions and others don't want to do the hard work. You know, their members don't want to teach difficult things. They don't want to tell students that they haven't done well when they haven't.
And one area I was very keen to talk to you about is Winston Churchill, and so particularly in the UK, Winston Churchill is a revered figure, and
yes,
and for a vast majority of the population. I mean,
yes.
The poll we had was 20 years ago now, but I suspect it'd still come out number one. If
the Greatest Britain poll, I've no doubt that if the Greatest Britain poll that was done 20 years ago, was done again today, it would be Churchill. Yes.
But so do you think, because I mean, it is bonkers to because again, it's lazy thinking. Historically, if you look at, I think one area is the Bengal famine. That has been disproven.
Yes. So I mean, there's two things to say. One is that people are, I think, will be surprised about the assault on Churchill. But I mean, it has been gathering pace, both in academia and in some popular books, and also, of course, literally on the streets. 2 years ago, the Churchill statue in Parliament Square repeatedly got vandalized and ended up having to be boxed up in an iron case for its own safety. And it was only unboxed when Emmanuel Macron came for some celebrations or commemorations of the Free French in London. And I think that at that point, the British authorities realized it was sort of embarrassing if the Prime Minister of the day was protected, his statue had to be protected from the modern British public. So they uncased him again. But I think people will be surprised at the ferocity of the attack on Churchill. It is now at the point that the BBC, whenever they run a story about Churchill, always have a link to their page of the 10 worst things he did, the 10 great crimes of Winston Churchill. Things like the Bengal famine have been litigated, they've been gone over and over, and I think the evidence is very clear that in the middle of the war, Churchill did what he could to try to assuage the appalling hunger that was going on in parts of Bengal, but and it was not successful. But he did ask, especially the Australians and others, to supply grain. But the allegations made by his accusers are not just that he didn't manage to do it, it's that he wanted Indians to die. I mean, it's such an outrageous smear on Churchill. And I mean, again, it's one of these things where it's also provably not the case. I mean, first of all, why would Churchill want fewer Indians? It is not made clear. And secondly, of course, even if he did, which he didn't, he was very bad at it because, of course, famously, the population of India boomed during the period of British rule. So anyhow, the point is that everything about this is deeply, deeply unfair as a historical exercise. But what interests me, and I think might interest your listeners as well, is why Churchill should have come in for such special attack. And if you look across the Atlantic to the US, where so many of these manias are coming from, precisely the same exercise is going on there. If you look at the way in which the founding fathers of America have been relitigated in recent years, or indeed, very interestingly, the historiography of Abraham Lincoln in recent years, you will see that a similar process of iconoclasm is happening there. And I'm aware you have a very sophisticated audience, so I don't want to belabor this point, but I believe there is a reason why this is happening. And that the reason is that what I'm describing in the War on the West is a revolutionary movement. It is a cultural revolution that is going on, is being attempted. Now, what does that have to do with Churchill or Lincoln? If you are carrying out a cultural revolution, you need to go to the holiest places of the civilization you wish to make subject. You need to destroy their holy places. You need to defecate on their altars. You need to deliberately show them that what they worshipped can be destroyed. And then you have a subjugated people. Now, some people might think that sounds extraordinarily extreme, but I ask you, why is the effort so strong to come for the most revered figures? You know, only a few years ago in the film Darkest Hour came up, there were accounts of audiences across the United Kingdom watching that film, which I thought was pretty good, actually. Watching that film, and when at the end, Churchill, who was it, Gary Oldman that plays Churchill, when he does the, we'll fight them on the beaches speech, and you remember that's how the film ends.
Yeah.
And that beautiful scene where one of the characters says, "What just happened?" Says to Halifax, "What just happened?" And I think it's Chamberlain says they give him the line. He just he recruited the English language and sent it into battle. Wonderful line. Now, that moment at cinemas across the UK, people stood up and cheered. There were many stories of cinema audiences standing and cheering because as you know, Churchill is more than just another figure in history. He is as sacred as you can be as a historical figure, and it isn't because we didn't know his flaws or don't know his flaws or think he didn't do anything wrong with it, but because he also represented what our parents or grandparents went through, and what they suffered for and fought for, and so this is deeply moving to many of us, to the British people, in the same way that Lincoln is deeply important to the American people, and it's not just because of the Civil War, which is enough, or freeing the slaves, which is enough, being victorious in the Civil War, or the Gettysburg Address. It's not just he kept the Union together, it's also that he had the crucial American success story, that he came from absolutely nothing. Lincoln probably, I was speaking to one of his biographers the other day, Lincoln probably had a total of 1 year's education. He basically grew up in the Iron Age. I mean, they had no running water, of course, they had nothing. And he became president of the United States. He read books, he taught himself. It is one of the great American success stories. Why would you come for Lincoln? The same reason they come for Churchill. They want to attack the holiest figures. They want to make people despondent and subjected and demoralized. And I'm afraid I think it's a big giveaway.
Now, I'm an optimist, Douglas. So with the audiences leaping up off their seats and clapping, the people who are trying to take down Churchill and Lincoln, I mean, this is an impossible task for them, surely.
Well, you say that, but I don't know that that is the case. I think it is possible. You see, I think that it entirely depends on what history ends up winning through. Now, of course, this is in itself a sort of ludicrous claim because nothing's ever settled. Reputations rise and fall and go through cycles and so on. And I mean, I should stress, and I say this in the opening of the war in the West, I don't want any of the debate to stop. I don't want anyone to be silenced, or I want them to be critiqued for sure, as I do. But I enjoy the debate. I think the debate is necessary, but it cannot be one-sided. And I'm afraid that if it is one-sided, and if you don't know, not just the specifics of your own nation's past, but have some idea of what the rest of the world was up to, I think you can do that. If you decide that anyone in the past who used the racial term that we would not use in 2022 is to be cancelled effectively, which seems to be, as I say, pretty much the decision we've come to, except for, as I say, the case of Karl Marx, who was a very vicious racist by modern standards, but weirdly isn't put through the same process. If you look at somebody like David Hume, whose reputation has been destroyed posthumously because one footnote of one of his essays, which all Hume scholars know about, has a nasty racist thing in it. If that's enough to have David Hume's name taken off buildings in Scotland and calls for his statue to be removed from the Royal Mile, then clearly no one knows where the stop levers on this damn cart are. And if you believe, as American school children are taught, that your founding sin as a country was slavery, if you're taught that and you don't know that every civilization in history had slavery, and that it just happened that America was started at a time when slavery was sadly commonplace everywhere in the world, if you don't know that, you could easily be brought up to believe that America was uniquely racist and was uniquely a country of slavery. If you don't know that, Winston Churchill was born in Victorian England, he would have had some Victorian attitudes because he was born in Victorian times. If you don't know that and know what the contexts of the time were, you could be told, well, he was a racist, and you would therefore decide. I realized this movement was underway some years ago, and I think I described it in the book, when after a lecture at a university in America, I had mentioned Immanuel Kant. I think partly because there's only two people I've ever known who really read and understood Kant. I admit to finding it exceptionally hard, partly because Kant is not a very clear writer. But also through my own intellectual failure, I'm certain of that. But I knew two people who really understood Kant, my late friend Roger Scruton, and also a professor of mine at Oxford. And I think I mentioned him in passing, probably because of the difficulty of reading Kant and understanding him. And a student said afterwards to me, that Kant used the N-word. And I couldn't work out why this student was saying this. I thought, well, first of all, it seemed unlikely, and I was trying to think what the German words would have been that he would have used. Anyhow, the point is that then I suddenly had this break. I thought, oh, I see. If you can call Kant a racist, then you don't need to read him. You see, because you're better than him, because you're not a racist, and you live in 2022, and he didn't live in 2022, and he didn't have all of our views, and therefore skip over it. Well, it's the same thing with the classics. And if anyone thinks I'm exaggerating, again, go and read things like the Washington Post piece 2 years ago, saying that Aristotle was the grandfather of scientific racism. Among Aristotle's sins, posthumously, were that, writing 2,300 years ago, he didn't have all of our views. Again, absolutely astonishing that. If you don't have your present in the right context, and you don't have anything in the past in the right context, you can actually be told anything. You can be persuaded that up is down and down is up, and that Churchill is a villain, and so on. I'm afraid that the fight for the history to be correct is one of the most important fights of all.
So, I mean, it's this laziness again with reparations, I think, because if you just say, look, we'll just throw money at the problem, But I watched and you make the arguments about how difficult the reparations question is. And I watched an interesting debate between Glenn Lowry and Christopher Hitchens discussing this very question.
Oh, yes.
It is interesting. Christopher Hitchens is in favor of reparations and Glenn Lowry is against.
Yes.
For the very reasons that it is lazy. It means we can just say, oh, okay, well, we dealt with all the issues you discussed earlier on in our chat. So let's just, write them a check. And then after that, anytime someone raises their hand for a problem, we go, well, we already paid you. So you can go away.
That's right. And you see, I'm very anti-reparations and for lots of reasons. One of which is that at this stage, I say this in the book, in the chapter on reparations, is, at this stage, we're not even talking about a wealth transfer from one group of people who did something wrong to another group of people who've been wronged. We're talking about a wealth transfer from one group of people who look like a group of people who did something wrong in the past to another group of people who look like the people to whom the wrong was done. Now, that is both practically and ethically a nightmare. And I am very, very concerned about the way in which reparations have returned as an issue. And by the way, I've actually just written about this for the Times of London. Look at the fact that it appears now that no member of the British royal family can go on any overseas trip without people claiming that they need to say sorry for slavery and pay reparations. Again, I'm sorry, but this is a failure of understanding of history. When the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge recently visited the Bahamas, there were calls for them to apologize for slavery, as if the royal family had never done so. Prince Albert apologized for slavery and described it as being one of the great stains on European civilization in 1840 at a public meeting in London. Just the other day, the Wessexes, the poor things, Edward and Sophie, Countesses of Wessex, were on an overseas trip. I can't remember where it was, St. Vincent, someone like that. Yeah. And there were calls for them to apologize for slavery and to pay reparations, for the Queen to pay reparations. This cannot be stressed enough. There is a phrase of Nietzsche's from the Genealogy of Morals that I steal here. There is a type of person who likes to pick at wounds that are in the process of healing or have long since healed, and then cry about the hurt caused to them. Nobody alive today took part in that slavery, and nobody alive today directly suffered because of it. Now, as it happens, today there are estimated to be around 40 million slaves in the world. I've actually met some on my travels, and people who were born as slaves. They're unbelievable.
And we don't hear anything about this.
We hear nothing about this. 40 million people, by the way, is more slaves than there were in the 19th century. So I am deeply concerned that in the name of picking at historic wounds, we actually don't deal with things in the present, and we misunderstand the past. We get the past in a faulty light, and reparations. My own view, and this may be contentious, but I put it out there anyway. My own view is that Britain already paid reparations for the slave trade. We paid it in the Royal Navy. We paid it first of all by George III signing the act that abolished slavery in the United Kingdom and her territories. And then in the Royal Navy policing the high seas for the next 6 decades and losing thousands of sailors, brave British young men who patrolled the high seas, boarded ships in incredible danger. There's a very good book about this, by the way, which I have somewhere by Anthony Sullivan, called Britain's War Against the Slave Trade, which I much recommend, about the operations of the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron between 1807 and 1867. It's a very interesting book. I found very helpful and credited. But I'm sorry, but we spent the 19th century paying reparations for slavery. And actually, in actual fact, it wasn't just in blood, it was also in treasure. Every British household paid more in goods throughout the 19th century because of our unwillingness to trade with slave trading countries. So I'm afraid I think that the reparations were paid long ago, actually, and people do not have the right to shake a tin 200 years later and demand a newly ignorant populace pay them in cash. I mean, it reminds me of that shakedown effort that occasionally happens at the UN. Robert Mugabe, the unlamented late Robert Mugabe, was a great expert at that. He would always call for reparations to be paid, and it was never quite clear whether some African leaders thought it should be paid generally. Robert Mugabe and certain other leaders believed it would be more convenient if the wire transfer went straight to his bank in Geneva, but that's another matter, perhaps.
So, Douglas, I want to end on a positive note, and your chapter on gratitude. Actually, I found it very beautiful, really.
Thank you.
And that moment on I'd read the Brothers Karamazov, but I can't. I've got to admit, I'd completely forgotten about that part. But it made me think. I remember a few years ago listening to the radio of a North Korean woman who'd escaped from a camp.
Yes.
Her uncle had done something.
Yes,
whole
family punishments. Yes, that's right.
But she was the most positive person in the world, and if someone like that can take that attitude, that's really the best way of looking at all these contentious issues, I think.
I couldn't agree more. What I say in the book is that, you see, everybody can be a person of ressentiment. It's not quite the same thing as resentment, but let's say everyone can be a person who's resentful. And actually, it doesn't depend on your race. It doesn't depend on your skin color, your sex, your sexuality, or even your socioeconomic income. It depends on you as a person. Are you a person who is resentful towards others, resentful to their successes? Well, everybody can be, and we all know people of resentment. And there can become civilizations and societies of resentment. And I quote the brothers Karamazov because there's a moment in that where Ivan speaks with the devil. And the devil in passing says, gratitude is not a sentiment I'm capable of. Only Dostoevsky, only a genius of Dostoevsky's greatness could have thrown that away so easily as a phrase. Why would the devil be incapable of gratitude? Because the devil would have to be incapable of gratitude. Because if the devil was capable of gratitude, he would no longer be the devil. And you see, my argument is, among much else in the war on the West, that we could be peoples of resentment. We could all bring up the next generation to reopen wounds and cry about the hurt. We could bring them up to hate what they don't have and to hate what they have. Or we could say, you know, what we have in Western democracies like Britain, like America, is not just unusual in historical terms, but highly unusual in the world today. The only country in the world that might compete with America in the 21st century to take over is China, led by the Communist Party of China. Chinese society, a Chinese communist society, look very different to our society. We would have none of the things that we take for granted. So my suggestion is recognize that what we have is good. Recognize that we can always improve, of course, that's uncontestable. But that if what we have is good, and we know that it is because the world still wants to come to us, Britain, America, these are the first and second countries of destination of migrants in the world. All the UN reports show that. So if people want to come to us, it must be because we do something good now. And if it's something good now, it means we did something right in the past. Not everything, but not nothing either. And I believe that just as you can walk down a street and look at your feet and contemplate the dust and more, so you can, as a society, as an individual, look up and marvel at what is around you. And what we have around us in the West is just marvelous. We have so much, and we would be such fools to throw it away or be persuaded to throw it away by people of resentment, relying and trusting on the possibility that we are a generation of ignoramuses.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end it. Just leaves me to say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation, Oliver, and all the best to you and to all of your readers.
So just a one-parter today, but I hope you did enjoy it. And if you didn't, I hope it made you think about other points of view. And if you have any suggestions for me, by all means, please get in touch and you can get hold of me. As I said at the beginning, you can either get hold of me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ or through an email, history@aspectsofhistory.com. So coming up, and I mentioned this last week, but coming up we've got Gavin Mortimer talking about the founder of the SAS, David Sterling. We've got Giles Milton talking about Checkmate in Berlin. And we've also got Damien Lewis talking about his latest book as well. So I've got a heap of interesting subjects coming up. A couple of those are on the Second World War, and we've got another one on the Cold War. So I'll leave you now, and I hope you have a wonderful bank holiday weekend for those in the UK, and for those outside the UK, have a lovely weekend anyway. Thank you, and good night.